It's great to be back here again. It's Friday, Parashat Tetzeh. As we are on the threshold of war, the name of the portion seems to be obviously so connected to what's happening. It's been a very, very difficult week in Israel, and difficult weeks and months, and since the terrible attack and even before, we're going through a very hard time. And how do we approach it? What is our response? I mean, obviously we have to fight against evil in the world. We can't let the evil lift its head up. We're being attacked on all fronts, from within, from without. It's just unbelievable. And our soldiers are working so hard on the battlefield, and the tragedies are so great of the widows and the parents and siblings of all those that have been killed in battle. Not to mention the hostages still suffering in the dungeons of captivity, where the parents can't sleep or do anything, not knowing where their loved ones are at any moment. It's hard to believe what's going on. People that live abroad or people that disengage from what's happening don't realize, not always are thinking about the pain and what's going on here. But those of us who are living right here in the land, we are, it's on top of us, and we're constantly being bombarded as we speak now. There are missiles flying in the north. We don't know when a full-scale war is going to break out there. It's going to happen in a few minutes from now, a few days, a few hours. It's on the way. We can't let our hundreds of thousand people evacuate from the northern borders. It doesn't make sense. We have to restore order there as well, not to mention our other fronts within Judea and Samaria. Terrible things, as we all know, are going on here. And my question that I want to pose today for our lesson is, how could we add strength to our soldiers? Not only the physical strength in the battlefield, that they're doing what they can, of course, but in what way could we bring assistance to our soldiers in a spiritual way? Because we know there's also battles, not only in the physical battlefield, but there's a spiritual war. And things actually begin in the spiritual realm, and then from there they go on to the physical realm. So what way could we spiritually add energy and positive success in our battle against evil? And the answer is, of course, by doing good. That's very clear. In this week's portion, obviously there are many, many ways of doing good, and this week's portion is a particular focus. I want to do two verses I want to study with you a little bit, which hopefully through them we'll be able to apply a lesson to our lives that can help, and that will be successful in helping our soldiers in the battlefield and help Israel win this war. And I'd like to quickly just mention, and I'll open up before I begin with the words of the famous Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Meradin, a great rabbi who was born 1838. He lived till 1933, pre-Holocaust, right before the Holocaust. He passed away. He was born in Belarus, a great leader of Israel, known for his two major works. One was called Chafetz Chaim, the laws of guarding your tongue, speaking evil, God forbid. And the other, he wrote 6 volumes of Jewish law, a summary of the Jewish code of law called the Mishnah Berurah, very famous for it. And the Chafetz Chaim, in his introduction, he talks about the dangers of speaking evil, and he brings down examples, that God loves His people and God wants to keep them away from bad character traits. And by doing good, we obviously, by watching our character traits, we are adding, we are bringing a blessing upon ourselves. And he brings down the terrible sin of speaking evil, how much damage speaking evil has caused in the world. And he gives an example of the first sin by the snake was a sin of speaking evil, that he spoke evil about God, and he enticed Chava, the first woman of creation, and through that it led to the cardinal sins. So we see that the sin in the garden began with the evil snake speaking bad through speech, and he goes on to talk about how we see that when Joseph brought evil, he spoke evil about his brothers. He didn't realize that our rabbis explained that they didn't really do those things, but Joseph misread the situation. But nevertheless, that caused our going down to Egypt, and the whole scenario. We had to go down to Egypt with Jacob, and all that was a result of that, of the brothers being upset with Joseph for speaking bad about them. So that's also caused a very, very bad situation. And not to mention the destruction of our temples, we all know, was a result of the same day our spies came back and spoke evil about the land of Israel. That evil tongue of theirs was a day that the same day our temples were destroyed on the 9th of Av. And he brings other examples of this destruction of Beitar, of a city in Judah, was a result of also with Lashon Hara. We see that there's a great rabbi Tana named Rabbi Eliezer Modai that they spoke to Bar Kochva about him, and whatever it was, not all the details, but we see that the very tragic events were results of just evil speech. A person can say to himself, what is behind speech? But we see throughout the Torah how dangerous it is. And I want to go now, and as that is an introduction, I want to look at the two verses that I want to discuss in this portion regarding our speech. And in the beginning, they don't seem to be, at first glance, one may not at all relate to these verses in that way, referring to evil speech. But they are, and I'm going to explain that to you now. If we look in our portion, chapter 24, verses 8 to 9, it says, Hishamel benega tzahat sarat. You have to be careful with the nega. Nega is like a wound of sarat, of leprosy. Lishmo me'od v'lasot, to watch, be very careful to do everything that the priests, the Levites, for the tribe of Levites, will, as God commanded them. You have to watch over the laws regarding leprosy. Okay, so how does this relate to what we're talking about? We'll see in a moment. And then it's connected to the next verse, verse number 9. It says, you must remember, remember what God did to Miriam when she left Egypt. Okay? So we see from these two verses a connection of Miriam to leprosy. We all know, if we go back and think about what happened, if I take you back to the portion of Numbers, chapter 12, right? Where after Miriam speaks evil regarding her brother her brother Moshe. So what happened was that she got leprosy, and she was, the verses number 14 describe that God says, if a father would spit in front of her, she would have to be put away for 7 days in isolation. So she will be placed away for 7 days in isolation. After what she did, she spoke evil. In other words, the father got angry at her, she has to be punished. And it says in verse number 15, she was placed outside the camp in quarantine for 7 days. And then Va'amlo Nasad Le'asef Miriam, and the nation did not travel until she was gathered back into the camp. So we see, as a result of her speaking about her brother, evil about her brother, so everything was put on hold, and no one traveled until she finished her period where she was placed in quarantine, or in hezger, as we say, in isolation. Now, Rashi right away, regarding the first part of the first verse I mentioned, which says you must watch over the leprosy, the wounds of leprosy. What does that mean? And Rashi says like this, and I want to quote Rashi's commentary. Rashi says, "Shelo titlosh simanei tuma." Rashi explains, of course, based on our rabbis, that you should not pull off signs of uncleanliness. V'lo takutz et ha'baheret. In other words, if a person has a leprosy on his skin, that person is not allowed to pull it off. We know there are certain signs which the Torah just says these are signs that person is considered unclean. The priest has to announce that he's unclean, has become a leper, but a person can't tamper with it. He has to leave it on his skin, and he can't cut it off. Okay, so that's a prohibition, and you have to follow the Rashi explains, goes on to say you must follow exactly what the priests are telling you. Okay? So, and the next verse reminds us, of course, is Miriam. So it's as if the Torah is saying to us, something. Look what happened to Miriam when she sinned by speaking evil about her brother. Okay? And therefore, be very careful, don't do so, don't speak evil, because we know when someone speaks evil, it results in leprosy, as it happened to Miriam. And now the Torah is even saying it's an additional kind of teaching, is that you have to leave it on yourself. You can't remove that particular sign of uncleanliness, of leprosy, until it goes away by itself. You can't tamper with it. You can't cut it off. You have to leave it on yourself. Now, I'd like to read a couple of commentaries regarding this and develop this a little bit. The Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, he says like this. He says, "Yishameh b'nei Getzarat," and he says, "Shafilu melech Uzziah," even if it's a king of Israel, like Uzziah was a king of Israel, we know he became a leper. Lo yichabdu ele yazgiru v'yeshlichu uvadad yeshev. He goes, he can't get special treatment. I mean, Miriam was like, she was like a queen, right? The daughter, of Amram, as we all know, Moshe Rabbeinu, Miriam, Aaron HaKohen, the three great children of Israel, leaders, prophets of Israel. So as great as the prophet she was, she cannot be treated differently than anyone else, and she has to go into solitude. So that's what the Rashbam is saying even if it's like a king, they have to follow the rules regarding leprosy, and you you can't ignore those rules. The Rashbam goes on to say, he goes, when you will leave, just like when you left Egypt with Miriam, as it says again in the verse, I'll read the verse, remember what God did to Miriam when you left Egypt. And he says something very interesting. He says, even though the nation was on the shpilkis, they really wanted to start going already. The nation didn't go until Miriam was gathered. In other words, he learns from the word on the road, realizing how another important conduct, another important character trait. We have to wait for people. When people are in distress, although she's being punished for a sin even, for speaking ill about her brother. But nevertheless, the Rashbam learns out over here is that although they were Israel was excited about traveling already, they wanted to leave and go on with their march towards Israel. But nevertheless, they waited for her and not leaving her alone. And the rabbis teach us something very, very special. It's a beautiful teaching of measure for measure. The way we do and treat others, God will treat us. As we all know, and the Midrash brings down different examples in the tractate of Sotah and the Talmud. And we see an example of Miriam herself. Miriam herself, the fact that she waited for Moshe Rabbeinu, she waited for her brother when he was thrown inside the Nile River. She stood aside, as it says in Exodus 2:4, she stood from a distance to watch over and see, what would happen to her brother. And therefore, all of Israel had honored her and waited for her because she waited for her brother. All of Israel waited for her, which is so beautiful of an explanation of every good a person does, God rewards us for the good. So with the good and the bad. And here she's being punished. She was outside the camp, but nevertheless, all of Israel waited to honor her for her noble responsibility for her brother. And here, and I want to read the beautiful words of Nachmanides, which adds to this whole teaching, because Miriam wasn't a simple person. She was obviously a prophetess. She was, Moshe Rabbeinu's sister, a great, great righteous woman. And the Nachmanides writes on his commentary, a couple of places he writes on this verse, and also on his commentaries on the book of commandments. We know there are 613 commandments, and different great rabbis have listed them and wrote different books listing what we call Sefer Mitzvot, the book of commandments. And Maimonides has a book like that, and other great giants have written books like that. And Nachmanides writes commentaries on Maimonides' listing, and he writes like this. There he writes, and he writes it also here in the portion. So I'll just read perhaps the explanation of our portion, which is basically very similar, because he comes to the same conclusion. And he writes like this. He says, "Ulefi da'ati, she mitzvat aseh mamash. He goes, here, there's a positive commandment. I mean, we have, obviously, in our Judaism, we have 613 commandments, which every time we behave and we fulfilling our commandments, we're bringing a great blessing upon us, we're rectifying us, right? So it's not the decision of what's a commandment and what isn't a commandment of the Torah is very, very important to know, how, to try to contemplate and think about as we do each one of these commandments that we can do, we rectify something. So it's important to know, that's why the rabbis went out of the way to list them, to list the different mitzvot, right? Some commandments are not listed by others because they're included in others. So, but it's a very, very important work to study the book of commandments, to know what we have to do and how to behave. And the Ramban writes like this. He says, according to his opinion, this commandment of remembering what happened to Miriam, he goes, this is a positive commandment. Okay? Just as we have to remember the Sabbath. It says, you shall surely remember the Sabbath. You shall remember, in this week's portion also we learn about remembering what Amalek did to us. So we have to remember what happened to Miriam. He says it's a positive commandment. And he says, like this, he says, V'hi azara miledaber lashon hara, right? And this is a warning to speak evil. Yitzaveh b'mitzvat aseh sheniskor onesh hagadol she'asa Hashem letzadek et haneviyah. So he's saying, and he's using very powerful words, he's saying, this is a positive commandment that we must remember the punishment that God did to the great righteous prophetess, Miriam. Shelo dibra ela b'achi, who did she speak evil about? Only about her brother, Gamul Chazda, right? He was the one who received her love and kindness. She loved him so much, right? Asher ahavato kinafsha, she loved him like she loved herself. She loved her brother more than anything. It's a beautiful way of expressing himself. The Nachmanides, how much she loved her brother, and everything she did was for his sake. So when she spoke evil about her brother, she was someone he loved, and she did it, of course, having positive intention behind it. V'lo dibra b'fanav sheyivosh. She didn't speak in front of him so she'll embarrass him. V'lo b'fnei rabim, and she didn't speak in front of many people. Rak beina levein achia, she only spoke between her and her other brother Aaron, quietly, b'tzina. V'chol maseh tovim lo ho'iluha, but all the good deeds and all that she did and the love she did for her brother, that she waited for him, all that, it didn't help. Gam ata im teshev be'achicha tedaber b'ven imecha, rather, Maimonides is quoting the verse in Psalms when a person is behaving like a clown and talking about his own family, his brother. Psalms 50, you could reach Psalms 50 and see the verse inside. So in reality, how good of a righteous woman she was, she made a mistake over here. And therefore, the Ramban is very powerful in saying that this is a positive commandment, and that we are required to, to abstain from speaking evil. And here, the beautiful thing, of course, is learning about the power of evil, speaking evil. That someone so righteous as Miriam, she was punished. All the more so those who were speaking left and right about so many people and not having good intentions and all that. So the story, the teaching here in the Torah is so powerful to bring from the actual live story of Miriam to teach us this law of preventing, of abstaining from evil. We have to be very, very careful with our tongue. And that's one beautiful direction of Nachmanides and what we saw and how important this is. And when I wrap things up, I'm going to talk about what I opened up with, adding the spiritual energy to our soldiers. But before I do so, I want to show you another very, very important teaching regarding this. And that teaching is based on one of the students of Rav Yosef Karo. His name is Rav Mordechai HaKohen. And he wrote a book called Siftei Kohen. And he writes like this. He lived in the early 1500s, and he writes like this regarding the commandment we're talking about. And he says, first of all, I don't know if I'm going to read everything, but okay, maybe I'll try. We'll try to go through quickly what he says. He says, Od Yishameh b'nei Gatzarat. He's talking about You have to be, what mentions, we read about in the verse 24, that we have to be careful with the lesions of leprosy, right? And our rabbi said we can't cut it off, okay? We can't cut out those lesions. And he writes like this. He says, he basically has a question for us, because it says here, when you have to listen to the Kohanim Leviim, the priests, the Levites. It doesn't make sense, he says. Of course, we can explain it in a simple understanding. The priests from the tribe of Levi. So that's one way. But he questions that understanding, and he says, it doesn't make sense, because it says the Kohanim. We know that the ones who are in charge of teaching us about the laws of leprosy are the priests, not the Levites. So why is it stressing the Levites? And he says like this. He says, I'll read those few words. He says, so he's saying everything that the Kohanim, the priests, will teach you, and the Levites. He says, what do they have to do with Negayim? It's not their job. It's only done through the Kohanim. It's not done through the Levites. So he's saying, he's saying the Levites, but they're the ones who are teachers. The whole tribe of Levi, we all know, were Torah scholars. So the Levites were, anyone in the tribe was a Torah scholar. As it says in Deuteronomy 33, verse 10, they will teach your statutes in Jacob. Because he's saying, if it's going to be a scenario where the priest is not going to be a learned priest, there could be many priests from priests of Israel, but they're not learned. Doesn't mean that they're all learned, right? So what happens if the priest is not learned? Therefore, he's saying, so the Levites from his tribe will tell him what to say. They can't rule regarding leprosy. They can rule, but doesn't have any impact unless the Kohen says the word with his mouth. So they tell the Kohen, who's not so learned, what to say, and he follows suit. Okay? Right? So he's saying, if they say this is considered unclean, they tell the priest, and the priest will say it, and he's unclean. Or if he says he's pure, the priest will say pure, and he's pure. The person who has the leprosy. Right? All depends on what the priest says. But the Levites are standing behind him and guarding him. Therefore, that's why it says the Levites, because they're also involved. So basically he's saying, a person shouldn't say to himself, this particular Kohen that's now on his doing his guard, they each have their certain times to do their guard and etc. They're going, whatever it is, or the one that lives in his area, and they go to that Kohen and they say, listen, I have this leprosy and all that, and then they're worried, they're concerned that he's not a learned Kohen. So no, that's why the Torah is stressing, don't worry about that. There will be other Levites that will stand with him, helping and guarding him. And you cannot avoid, doing what you have to do. So that's just technical stuff. And then he goes on to say, he says, okay, then he goes on to say, this is really what I wanted to get to. He's saying you must accept upon yourself the law with love. You have to remember what happened to Miriam when she got her leprosy. She took upon it, she received it with love. In other words, that she accepted her situation. She didn't complain. As we all see, because she accepted, he's saying a beautiful teaching, because she accepted with such love her situation, all of Israel waited, including the divine presence, right? As we all know, they didn't travel in the desert without the clouds of glory moving. So the clouds of glory remained, they didn't do anything. They all waited for her honor. Therefore, the Torah teaches us, you must remember what happened, what God did to Miriam. When a person shouldn't When God forbid he has terrible tragedy coming upon him, right? As we are in Israel now, we shouldn't, God forbid, despise our trials and tribulations. We can't just kick them away and say, why did it happen to us? Why is it happening to us? God will not in any way cheat anyone out in any way. Every bit of reward coming to you you'll get. And from here another thing he's saying, a person should learn. Right here he's learning from the thing. Let's say a person has a little leprosy on his skin and he wants to solve the problem by cutting it off. We said you can't do that. That's a prohibition from the Torah to cut it out. So he's saying, what do we learn from that? That you can't do an operation to remove your leprosy. It has to go away by itself when you repent. So he's saying that's another important lesson, that a person can't cut away God's reproof, that he's reproving him. He's giving him ethical teaching by sending him that lesion. And he can't just say, okay, I'm just going to cut it out, it won't be there anymore. He's saying, no. But he should accept it with a beautiful, beautiful happiness, with a smile. Because those that God loves, he will admonish. As it says in the Talmud. And when a person has lesions like this, and when a person has children, that is his atonement. It's like an altar for him. Just as an altar is a atonement of all of Israel, the same way when a person has different kind of wounds and bruises from leprosy, all kinds of other things that come upon him, he has to realize that God is doing this for his own benefit. And he has to accept it. But a person should be happy. Because it's coming to cleanse him. And the Talmud says, Rava, the Talmud says in the Talmud in Arachim, that one of the great rabbis, he would, when 40 days would go by and he would have 40 easy days, he would say, oh my goodness, I ate up my future world. He was afraid. 40 days went by and he didn't have any suffering. In other words, if they're not a person to do any sins, so why is he getting this terrible tragedies? So it could also be as a trial. And he brings down the example. When a person is making pottery, and he wants to test the strength of the pottery, he doesn't hit the hammer on the broken pieces, but he hits the hammer on a whole piece of pottery. In other words, to see if it's able to bear the strike. Now, this is a beautiful explanation of this. If they Kohen have to understand, is that the Torah is teaching us many, many different layers here of ethical teaching. As we spoke about, number one, to guard our tongue, and remember what happened to someone righteous like Miriam. All the more so, people who don't have those righteous ways, and they're speaking all the time, unfortunately, evil. And here he's learning from the fact that we can't remove the leper. The leper cannot remove his leprosy, but he has to have it heal itself and accept his pain and accept the embarrassment of being a leper and let that rectify him. And in other words, to accept it with love and do the internal spiritual work to make it go away, and not try to do something externally by just cutting it away and say, okay, I can eliminate it, I can do something externally. Now, after these small teachings, I'd like to just summarize and try to bring it all together. We spoke about what could we do today in Israel in this very, very difficult situation with all the suffering that's going on now. And the answer is, number one, we have to strengthen our faith in God and realize that everything, even if we're all perfect, we have nothing to rectify, so then God is testing us. But of course, we all know that we have so many things to rectify. We see how many people, how much evil speaking about one another, and politics is going on, this one against that one, and terrible lack of brotherly love. So the reasons of what's going on are so clear. The handwriting is on the wall. We have to wake up and realize that we have to really begin to show true love for one another. And enough is enough. You want people to wake up and realize And that alone is enough to cause such terrible tragedy. So if we have to look on the positive side, let us begin to speak properly about one another. Let us strengthen our faith in God. Let us strengthen our Torah study. All these things will bring us a blessing and give strength to our soldiers in the battlefield. If we focus on being positive, that's the answer for everything. Positive attitude is what will make or break everything. And we see that the whole thing, the external, people always are trying to cover over, always such a superficial level of cutting away, trying to find simple problems, solve problems in a simple way without getting to the root source of it. So they just want to cut away the outer layer of the problem and think it's going to go away. And that was the whole conception regarding terrorism and what the Hamas was doing to us and all the other dangerous forces around us, that will just, we'll do something, cosmetic changes or something like that, will solve the problem. But in reality, that didn't do anything, because the evil just got stronger and stronger. It's growing in the deep roots. We have to uproot it from the roots all the way in the deepest places. And that is exactly the example of the tzarat. You can't just cut it away superficially. You got to get to the root of the problem. And that is saying, wait a second, what did I do wrong that caused that leprosy? Why are we having this problem? And when we get to that root of the problem, we will solve it, and it won't come back anymore. And then that's really, it all depends on our true devotion and repentance, and that will give us strength to our nation. So this is such a, again, this small teaching of 2 verses in the Torah. There's just so much here, and we can talk about it, obviously, for just days, focusing on how to apply this to our lives. So my recommendation for now is summarizing everything. How do we bring about a change in Israel and strengthen our soldiers? Just say the word good, good, and good. Be good. Focus on good in every way. Examine your actions. Before you do them, are you doing the right thing? Are you doing a good thing? And that will bring a tremendous blessing to our nation, and now we will overcome all evil. Shabbat Shalom, Besarot Tovot, Yeshuot, V'Nechamot.